Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stoa. I'm the host today. My name is Raven, and today we're being joined by Simone Collins and Malcolm Collins to hear about the case for pronatalism. And they're both very excellent people to be talking about this subject. They're the founders of pronatalism.org and the Collins Institute. And they've written many books called The Pragmatist's Guide to Many Issues Relating to Sexuality, Relationships, and the Formation of Cultures. And so today we're going to hear all about this case and go into conversation after their presentation. So with that, I'll hand it over to the two of you.
Thanks. We're so excited to be here. These are all really fun flashpoint subjects. And we've also found that they're sort of a litmus test or like a Rorschach test for people's big points of contention and interest. So one thing we'd like to do is also come into this with a fairly unstructured approach, meaning that Malcolm is going to touch on some major themes, but we're really open to taking the conversation in whatever direction really sparks people's interest after sort of hearing the gist from Malcolm.
Yeah, so I'll just start with basic stats because I think that a lot of people are really unfamiliar with how advanced the fertility crisis is right now. When I started caring about this, I was working as a venture capitalist in South Korea, and I had to constantly, plot the future of the country. Where's the economy going to be in 50 years or whatever? And if you look at Korea's, so let's look at the fertility rates today, which is 0.8 or 0.7, depending on what you're looking at. That means for every 100 Koreans alive today, there will be between 6.6 and 4.3 great-grandchildren. And this is continuing to decline every year. So it's almost certainly going to be worse than that. And I remember I took this to my boss, and I was, not my boss, another partner at the firm. And I was like, hey, there's not going to be an economy here in 100 years. What's going on? Like, this seems like a very big deal that like everyone should be like running around the streets panicking about. And what I got is it's sort of oh, we just pretend that's not the case. It's a bit like in Florida right now. If you buy a house on one of the atolls that like even most conservatives agree will not be there in 30 years, the price on a 30-year loan there is the same as the price of a 30-year loan in the center of Florida for real estate, because the markets just haven't like accepted that such a big shift is going to happen. And this is when I began to get really panicked. And coming back to the US, and the other thing I learned in South Korea is there's no bottom floor on this. And this is sort of true across the world. No developed country has really hit this bottom level where it stops decreasing. And coming back to the US was like going back in time 20 years and sort of getting a chance to play it over again. And yet I see the exact same series of events playing out here in the US. So what Simone says when she says it's a litmus test is really interesting. You bring this up with people on the left, and the typical answers are, oh, well, we can fix it with immigration. But if you're in the US, as of 2 years ago, by UN numbers, all of Latin America, so Central America, South America, and the Caribbean combined fell below replacement fertility rate. On average, a country, so it's not like developing countries that are below, that have high populations. It's like only desperately poor countries. On average, when a country gets above $5,000 yearly salary for a citizen, it falls below replacement rate. And then the other thing you often hear on the liberal side is, oh, well, people don't have enough money. But within and between countries and within and between cultures, the less money you have, the more kids you have, until you get to extreme levels of wealth. So in the US, you're not above fertility rate again until your family is pulling in $500,000 to $1 million a year. And if you look at countries that offer free childcare, like have really heavy spending, like Sweden, on childcare, they often have some of the lowest fertility rates. So that's not an answer. If you go to conservatives, what they often say is, oh, well, this means to protect these fragile cultures we have, we need to lower immigration rates, right? But the problem there is, like, objectively, if you look at the data, the more monocultural and monoethnic a society is, the lower the fertility rate. So, if you wanted to create a monoethnic monoculture, like that's what Korea is. And they're so much worse on this than us. And you can actually look at like a list of the top lowest fertility countries, and they're almost all monocultures. If you look at the developed world, the countries that show the most resistance to post-prosperity fertility collapse are like the US, France, and Israel, all really diverse countries. And you can even see this within different cultural groups. So suppose you're looking at Muslims, right? If you look at a monoculture like Iran, which is like a Shia, monoculture, their fertility rate is 1.7. They actually fell below replacement rate about 10 years ago, and they've been doing everything they can, like everything that China's trying now. They've been trying for about a decade, and none of it has worked. And if you look at Muslims of a similar cultural background in a multicultural environment like India, their fertility rate at similar economic levels is about 2.3. So what's really interesting is that just the fertility crisis doesn't really fit our existing narratives. And The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion is the book that we wrote on this subject because, I mean, we had written on relationships and sexuality, and relationships are just in a terrible spot right now, and that's something we can riff on. But the only thing that seems to offer real resistance to this are a few conservative religious traditions. Specifically, the highest resistance is conservative Judaism. So if you look at Israel, it is the only country, if you look at like countries that are predicted to be at above replacement fertility rate at the turn of the century, it's like 2 countries in Africa, Kazakhstan, and Israel. And Israel is just like crazy on this list. And even now they have a fertility rate of 3. And within most of the developed world, it's the conservative Christian communities that have been able to keep their birth rate high, although it's often not the communities you would expect. So a lot of people think it's like Mormons, but actually Mormons have actually fallen below replacement rate or will within 5 years. Their fertility rate has crashed in the last 5 years or so. It's more like evangelical quiverful families who have been able to keep rates really high. So that's sort of an intro to the subject. There are some other things we can talk into if people are interested: the economic effects, the genetic effects. One thing that just isn't really talked about in the media, but it's a whole field of academic research called genopolitics, is our sociological profiles and the way we vote have genetic components. And you can actually calculate out, like in the US through differential fertility rates, how quickly we should expect at a genetic level voting patterns to change. And we're probably looking at a 1 standard deviation shift to the right in the next century. Yeah, happy to put it to the audience now, because that's just sort of the. Is there anything you want to add, Simone?
That's a gist. I'm curious to see what people find interesting, questionable about this, where people's stances are with kids, why they are not pronatalist, or what they're concerned about with long-term futures of different cultures. There's a lot of places where we can go this.
First Stoa guest was rifle on cam. Hey, Simone, you could turn your camera. You have...
My AR. Oh, you can't see it from here.
Oh, it's behind your coat.
Yeah, it's behind my coat. Yeah.
Nice.
Everyone, guys.
Culture here.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm interested in hearing more about the kind of economic side of this. Peter Zeihan obviously talks a lot about this in his work. He's great, yeah.
Okay, so
but he talks about the consumer side of this problem. A lot of people think that we can replace some of the producer sides of this with AI, robots, but how the economy works with young people coming up into their 20s and spending a lot of money, and how that works with the larger economic structure. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so Peter Zeihan is hugely underselling the issue in the US. So I'm going to talk with a US focus. Like, China is just screwed. They are a non-player on the world stage. He is right. Russia has no future. Like, that's a modern self-genocide we're seeing right now. If you look at just their fertility rates combined with the amount of population and their young death rates, they have really young lifespans. Anyway, but let's just talk about the US. The problem with the world as we have it right now is it's a bit of a pyramid scheme. That's like the entire Western economy right now. For the past 350 years or so, every year on average, if you were an idiot and you shotgunned money onto the economy, it grew on average, okay? This was happening for 2 core reasons, because populations were growing exponentially. And I mean like stupidly exponentially. That's why now, even though, over half the world's population lives in a country below replacement fertility rate, population is still going up, because for a while, it was just shooting up like a rocket, and it was obviously unsustainable and like not a good thing. And like, we are not for that at all. But where was I going with this? But what that caused is if you have a population that's increasing exponentially and then a productivity per worker, which is increasing linearly, which people often get wrong because technology has been increasing exponentially. So they think that the productivity per worker has been increasing exponentially, but just like for whatever reason, it's almost linear, at least in comparison to population growth. What that means is the population starts to decline quickly and we can't replace them with AI, which could fix this. I'll get to that in a second. It means that we're going to have an economy that is decreasing on average every year. And that in our world, recessions are like these brief, upsetting blips, whereas increases in the economy would be brief, promising blips, but the average trend would be downwards. But that breaks a lot of our systems. So people like jump on Social Security as being sort of the Ponzi scheme, but Social Security is the smaller Ponzi scheme when you're talking about the economy. The bigger one is debt. So debt, we have debt at the level of our cities, at our states, at our nations, and we have leveraged them as high as possible. So we're in the private equity industry, Simone and I. And when you buy a company, debt's a miraculous thing. If I'm making a $10 investment and $8 of that is debt and $2 is equity, and that investment grows only 20%, an additional $2, my equity has increased 100%. But if it decreases just 10%, I've lost half of my equity. We have lived in such prosperous times because our governments have cheesed the economic system with debt with the assumption of constant growth. And this is how Detroit collapsed. When they collapsed, 50% of their payments were going to what was functionally debt, like maintaining a police department's pension for when the police department was like 2 times bigger than it was today, maintaining a fire department's pension for when it was 2 times bigger. And this pension is where it gets really interesting, because if you look at a city like Manhattan, you're like, oh, only 7% of the funding is going to debt. However, 30% of the payroll is going for unpaid pensions. So they're getting close to the numbers Detroit was at when it functionally collapsed. And this is a big problem because we have set up a lot of our cities due to progressive tax policies to essentially serve the ultra rich. By that, what I mean is if the primary person putting money, taxes into the city, the primary customer of the city is the ultra rich, that means the cities need to bend themselves to serve the ultra rich, because in New York, I think it's 0.5% or 0.4% of the population were to leave, the wealthiest, they'd lose about 50% of their tax base. Sorry, I'm going too long here. The way AI solves this is it allows you to cheese the number, just like massively increase the number of workers. And potentially you could even simulate these workers as having needs too. And they would have needs, they'd have energy needs and stuff like that. So that could solve some problems, who knows?
And Arn has asked a really interesting question, which is why push an antinatalist narrative? Who or what benefits from this? And also, what are the realistic solutions for declining birth rates? So I'll take a crack at the first, and Malcolm, you want to do the second?
Yes.
So I think a lot of people push antinatalist narratives because they are negative utilitarians. And also because there's sort of pervasive nihilism at play. But the general gist of negative utilitarianism is basically suffering is really bad. The human condition is suffering. And so if we make more humans, we make more suffering. Why would we do that? That's a bad thing. So,
well, and the positive emotions aren't good.
Well, yeah. Basically, the positive emotions that you have don't cancel out the negative emotions. In fact, like they're worse than the positive emotions you have. So even if someone has more positive emotions in their lives than negative emotions, like still the fact that they have those negative experiences is enough to say it's better that they didn't exist. Yeah. There's also a sort of pervasive environmentalist view of, humans are the ones that ruin everything. Humans are evil. They pollute. There are all these wonderful, beautiful, natural things on the planet. Why don't we let nature take back over? Wouldn't the world be better off with just nature? So there's sort of that group as well. And then there are lots of people who I think, just like with COVID, it was really hard to understand, to wrap your head around what it would mean for the whole world to go on lockdown, for global supply chains to be disrupted, for us to completely change the way that we live our day-to-day lives. And I think very similarly, many people have trouble wrapping their heads around the economic, social, and governmental ramifications that Malcolm has described thus far. Like, it makes sense in theory, but also like, yeah, but things couldn't change that much, could they? That's just like, we're not really built for that kind of change, like to be ready for that mentally. So I think a lot of people are like, like, no, right now it's just like the cities are too crowded. There are too many people. Like these immediate problems would be better if there were fewer people. And so they also sort of see things as being that way. And then finally, I would say that a lot of popular culture is built around optimizing for and idolizing and pedestalizing very different types of lifestyles. So a single and childless lifestyle is going to max out more social capital points right now than being a parent. We put on a pedestal travel, freedom of movement, living this like bon vivant life of going out to dinner and being social or being famous or being young and beautiful and all these other things. And a lot of that flies out the window when you have kids because you need to spend money on other things. Traveling is harder. You have all these other responsibilities. That just seems kind of not fun. And in a world in which people are more optimizing around hedonistic pleasure, or at least pleasure in general, the idea of making all these sacrifices to have kids, especially more than 2 kids, just seems like, why would you do it if you have no exogenous cultural reason to do it?
And I think Simone really captured a very important point there, is this exogenous cultural reason. So if you are part of a social community, right, and that community, a third of them are having no kids and a third of them are having 2 kids, for that population to stay stable, the final third has to be having over 4 kids. And we just don't live in a society where many people are having over 4 kids, because when you're basically having above 2 kids, you are not doing that to make your own life feel better. Like, it doesn't increase your personal hedonism. It doesn't make anything easier for you, really. So the only reason you do that is if you have some ideological reason to do that, typically religious, or unfortunately for some people, like racial or stuff like that. Or you understand the problem of pronatalism and you're working on that. And this is where solutions come into play that I think are really interesting. Well, also, it's why our organization doesn't focus on people who have no kids. Like, the goal of our organization is not to convince people who have no kids to have 2 kids or 1 kid. It's to convince people who have 4 kids and to make it easier for people who have 4 kids to have 9 kids if they want. That's where this problem really gets solved. And so if we look at society, so we sort of are like, if you look at this like we are looking at an ecosystem, right? Like, I'm an ecologist and I'm looking at an ecosystem. The job of an ecologist is not to maximize, the number of bunnies in the world. I can look at an ecosystem and be like, okay, there's this pollutant in the ecosystem and it's causing many species, much of the diversity within this ecosystem, to be lost, and their populations are crashing really quickly. And that's what we're seeing in the developed world today. But the problem is that the pollutant is what we call, we have like an acronym for it, but basically it's prosperity, access to education, gender equality, and technology. This is the pollutant that's causing people to sterilize. The problem is that we like the pollutant. We want more of it. We want it everywhere. Like, people are like, oh, but Africa still has a high birth rate. But our goal is to spread prosperity and education and technology to Africa. We want everywhere to have this pollutant. So what we need to do as ecologists looking at this is to find a diversity of different things or species in this environment, if we're using the ecological example, that seem to be resistant to the pollutant, and then care for them, provide little bubbles for them so that they can intergenerationally adapt to the pollutant and become strong again, right? So you want to save some species of grass, some bunnies, some trees. And that is the way that our foundation works. Now, what's cool is that pronatalism is a very tractable issue, which means I don't need to save, like, so if I look at like our family as a cultural group, right? If we had 8 kids and they had 8 kids and you did that for just 11 generations, that'd be more descendants than live on Earth today, right? So you typically really only need to quote unquote save 1 resistant family from each cultural group to preserve that aspect of our current pluralistic society.
So, I mean, in terms of declining birth rates and realistic solutions. Malcolm touched on government subsidies not really making a difference, tax breaks not making a difference. Basically, I mean, don't get us wrong. I think parents and families would love to see more money.
We want that money. Get the government subsidies, please, but it doesn't help functionally.
So functionally, the things that seem to make a big difference. Actually, can anyone guess? Is anyone aware of the policies that have actually seemed to show a pretty significant change? No? Okay. Well, imagine that you are very religious, and imagine that one of the senior religious figures in your religion will baptize your child. That is what has so far been shown to be really motivating. Is a cultural. What?
Gosh, I want to say it was Romania or something.
I think it's Romania. Let me double check. We're
anyway,
right now.
But no,
yeah, basically.
Actually, where was it?
Go ahead.
Actually, the single most effective way to get birth rates up, and some countries have found this, is ban female education or make economic policies that crash your economy.
Well, I'd rather not. Let's not have that be. I don't see that as a solution. When the solution is let's remove 50% of the population.
It is one of the things that we're really worried about, because I think people underestimate. They see the world today because the world has been moving sort of in one direction for the past 100 years or so. And they're just it's going to always continue to move in this direction, right? Of pluralism and acceptance. Yet society has moved here before a number of times. We had the Renaissance, we had, the Athenian city-state, we had the height of the Roman Empire, and in all of those eras, you had gay culture get more accepted. You had pluralism get more accepted. And then there were crashes. And we're kind of due for one right now.
Okay, it was by the way, it was the Georgian Orthodox Church. Where they basically said that the patriarch of this church will personally baptize any baby born to parents with more than 2 children, which they found significantly increased.
Subsidies not working. Last year, Hungary gave out 5% of its GDP in subsidies, and it only got fertility rates up 1.6%. Now, if you contrast that with China's fertility collapse, in 2020, their fertility rate collapsed, I think, around 20%, and then 13% in 2021. I haven't looked at the 2022 numbers yet, but China is in such a catastrophically bad place right now.
Actually, China, so that's a really good jumping off point to where things can get if we have basically a hard landing on demographic collapse. So one, first, we're not saying the world's population needs to indefinitely grow. That's not what we're saying. But I think what we're also trying to point out is there are 2 ways this can go. One is we're just going to hit a hard landing on demographic collapse. No one's going to plan for this carefully. We're just going to head into it the way that we're heading right now. The other approach is, okay, let's be thoughtful about this. Let's plan for a shift in the way our economy fundamentally works. Let's plan for, trying to sort of salvage pension funds and city infrastructure. Let's plan for, protecting women's rights in the face of all this. What happens in the face of not planning is what China is already starting to do, which is close vasectomy clinics, limit access to birth control. A lot of people look at us and they're like, oh, you just want a Handmaid's Tale. And we're like, no. We want to prevent a Handmaid's Tale. We want to prevent disempowerment of women. We want to prevent all these more forced actions. And what we're going to see is, as some nations get a lot more desperate, they are going to start to force more things, do more dystopian, creepy things.
So somebody asked, explain the Russian economy. So the average Russian earns around $16,000 a year. Now, while that's poor by US standards, it's well above the rate at which a country falls below repopulation rate, which is $5,000 a year. So really, any country outside of desperate poverty. Now you're saying, why are Russia, why is their fertility rate lower than other countries? There's a number of interesting, so generally, if a country's poor, it'll have a higher fertility rate than a rich country. But there's always going to be exceptions to this rule. And what pushes Russia and most of the Soviet bloc countries to be an exception to this rule, where their fertility rates are uniquely low? So you have a few reasons for this. In many territories in Russia, they're monocultural. I would bet if you looked at the multicultural parts of Russia, you'd see a much higher fertility rate. And I actually wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the impetuses from the war right now, is for Putin to try to kill off the non-Slavic ethnicities, which are growing at a too fast a rate. Because they are outgrowing. That's a bit of a conspiracy theory, but that also is where the disproportionate number of troops are coming from. Yeah, that could be it. Also, when people don't have sort of pride or excitement about their cultural group's future, they have really low fertility rates. I think the big question, like if you're looking at fertility rates, the two big groups to look at are US evangelicals and Israel. Like, why do those two groups do so well when most of the stats say they should be doing really poorly? And I think the answer is that they have a lot of pride in their cultural group, and they have optimism for their children's future in the way that, you know, I don't think Russians or Han Chinese do right now, which is one of the reasons why I think China's fertility rate is so low, is that people feel like and you can hear this in the way the youth in China is talking, you know, like, we are the last generation. When somebody's like, you and the next 3 generations of your family, I don't know if you guys have seen this video, will be punished for this. And the guy, we are the last generation, and they slam the door. And it's this feeling of, if I have kids, because the state is so bureaucratic now and so corrupt, they will never move up, and they're just going to be tools for the rich in my country. And that they'll have no agency. And so why do that? Whereas I feel like some of these religious groups, which is why the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, trying to come up with new religious ideas, don't feel that way about their kids.
I'm curious if you could talk about your personal orientation towards this and dynasty building. Is that something that you all are thinking about actively in your own lives, and how are you approaching that?
Malcolm's smiling because that's part of what the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion is all about. It is about dynasty building. It is about how you can create a culture like from like whole cloth, just freshly and anew, that will be intergenerationally durable, which is to say that you will have children, raise them in this culture, and they'll have such a great experience growing up in that culture that they in turn will want to have kids and raise those kids in that culture, and so on and so forth. Alternately, the book also details how you could reinforce an existing culture. Like, let's say that you are Catholic, and you want to make sure that your children stay Catholic and raise their children Catholic. How can you reinforce it in the face of globalism and modern technology, modern social media, modern education, to make it intergenerationally durable? So yeah, we think about this a lot. Our book details both tactically how to do this for your own culture, because we don't think our personal culture is appropriate for everyone, both like genetically and dispositionally and just generally culturally, but also we share a lot about our own culture and our own approach. And
So you want to talk about the future police, Simone?
The future police.
Yeah.
Is there interest in like
just go. You could be summarized.
Sure. Yeah. So our own, okay, thank you. Our own culture is what we'll call it secular Calvinism, meaning that we don't have a faith-based, monotheistic or polytheistic approach to life, but we do engage in descendant worship. So like Malcolm sometimes jokes, yeah, we have gods, but our gods are real. That's the difference. And so generally speaking, we have family holidays around what Malcolm alluded to, the future police, which is to say, like around New Year's, for example, it's sort of addictive gaming devices and social media devices get stolen from our children. And in order to win them back from the future police who stole them and hid them, they have to make pledges to the future about how they're going to make a better world come to pass, with the idea that basically you will be rewarded by far future descendants who have such amazing technology they can go back and manipulate the past, for doing things that create the future that must come to pass, things that are they're in favor of the future. And generally speaking, because we have a very mechanistic, deterministic, metaphysical understanding of reality from just like our understanding of the science and what we like the evidence that we have access to at present, we do actually think it's plausible that our very, very far descendants will have the ability that is akin to God's.
Yeah,
and
so
that we
what
really,
she means is like 10 million years from now, if
Yeah.
our descendants are still alive, would they be closer to the way we conceive of a person or closer to the way we conceive of a God? And like, we're looking at 100 years out, AI that can maybe digitize people and put them in heavens or sit behind our Alexas and listen to everything we do and answer prayers. Like, we are close to having gods in the world already. Well, God, things that would have been gods 100 years ago. I don't think it's this is how we sort of came to this. But anyway, that's our crazy idea there. If you're asking what our culture is, and we chose it because it forces our kids to constantly, one, it gives them a direct motivation to have kids. It gives them some like logic as to why somebody is watching them and rewarding them, but it also motivates them around trying to create a better future for distant humans. The sort of the human species as a whole, which I think is sort of a moral outwork I'm very comfortable passing on to my kids.
So something that kind of dovetails into our general approach and recommendations for people as they design their own religions / cultures is to look at your inherited tendencies and to look at sort of a culture that will jive well with your own intuitions and proclivities. So both Malcolm and I come from Calvinist backgrounds. We're very, very focused on the evidence, on personally reasoning through problems, on a mechanistic deterministic universe. We basically just took those tendencies and intuitions and biases, which we think to a great extent are inherited genetically, and we adapted them to make an intergenerationally durable culture. Now, if someone came from a very, very different background, maybe like for hundreds and thousands of years, their family has been Jewish, or for hundreds of thousands of years, well, okay, not thousands, for hundreds of years, their family has been Muslim. Probably a different metaphysical framework and cultural framework would jive better for them because of the general tendencies and traits that they've inherited from their ancestors.
So this is something we go over a lot of evidence in the book, is that genetic changes happen fairly quickly. And this is something I'm sure, if you have secular Jewish friends, you immediately get that they are secular Jewish, like their world perspective still has many Jewish tendencies, or if you have secular friends from different backgrounds. And so the idea is that if you're trying to recraft a culture, but there's also very Calvinist to not believe in trying and converting people and like, no, you figure it out for yourself. But yeah, I think that it makes sense to try to build your own while looking to what works for your sociological profile. Excellent. But this is also what we mean by trying to save as many species as possible in an ecology, right? Is we want to, the point of diversity is that people are different. If everyone was secretly the same, there would be no point in diversity. The point of trying to maintain a pluralistic society is that all of these different ways of seeing the world have value. And that's why it's worth trying to save this pluralism that we have today in society, whereas many groups are currently basically going extinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what are the challenges for you while bringing this into the public sphere? Like talking about cultural extinction, I feel is a quite taboo subject. Mm-hmm. Are you finding tension when trying to promote these ideas in the public sphere?
Oh yeah, I mean, you get called an aspect of our family that probably gets the most stuff is we believe very much in intergenerational improvement. So by that, what I mean is giving my kids the best shot possible. But one of the ways we do that is through genetic selection. So we have one of the first Gattaca babies, the first public one. It's something that gets us a lot of hate in the media, but also, I think for a long time, white nationalists have sort of been like the people talking about this issue. And so, a lot of people want to hate on you for that. I also think that it doesn't fit current progressive narratives. A sad truth is, and I think we learned this, with COVID and stuff like that, is sometimes if you're just not something that the system has decided is a big issue yet, like you're not on message, then you're a Nazi. And then they change what the message is in 5 years, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, of course, we never said they were Nazis. but I think that this is just one of those issues where it's so obvious from the numbers. It's a big problem that like I feel very comfortable with where I'm standing on this issue now. And I think that one of the unfortunate, sad things about this issue is it will not become obvious in an economy until after it is too late. And by that, what I mean is you can have a demographic set where 80% of the people are over the age of 50 and they're never going to have another kid, but they still have half their life left, right? You don't notice, like the population doesn't begin to rapidly drop until after it can't be fixed. So, I mean, I'm okay with a lot of people hating on us. I mean, Simone, what are your thoughts?
Ironically, the groups that are seen as most like obsessed with this, like white nationalists, we'll say are not, they're not the ones that are at risk, really. So like the groups that we're really keen on helping out, like Jains, South Koreans, Parsi, like they're not like rural white groups, and the rural white groups are going to be fine. So we also like, we're not too worried about criticism because we're like first not really trying to help the groups that are already fine. And the groups that aren't fine are not typically the ones, called Nazis or eugenicists or anything else. They're just like normal cultural groups that are seeing really low birth rates. RN asked a really good question, which is that, do we see the future as apocalyptic or bright? I think the answer is yes to both. So I think when we see children of men is not, I wouldn't say exactly a likely outcome, because in the end, the only groups that are going to remain are the very high birth rate groups. So it's going to be, in the future, we're going to see kids everywhere. It's going to be this really weird future in which, there are lots of families, there are lots of kids, because those are the people who are going to survive. Basically, all the low birth rate cultures are, as we call them in the book, sterilizing memes. They will go extinct because they are not having kids. And one of the things, and this goes back to why we're so interested in preserving plurality, is a hard landing on demographic collapse, in which we're not planning for this, we're not trying to be intentional about this, leads to potentially a cultural monoculture in which like only like 3 cultures that manage to have really high birth rates are the ones that are pervasive throughout the world. Like that's the new future of humanity. And it's just like 3 meme sets, which really has us worried. Like what we'd rather see is like 842 different unique cultures, all with high birth rates, all competing, all bouncing off each other, sharpening each other, competing. Like that is like, that's the world in which we, I think, are thriving as a human race in the future. That's where we'll deal with orthogonal problems really well, because someone's going to come up with a solution. So the cool thing though, and why we're not like, why this is a cool problem and a very tractable problem is that if just 5 families from each low birth rate culture that is currently endangered, we'll say, is able to build an intergenerationally durable culture and pass that on, that culture will survive. Like, the impact that you can have through having kids and through those kids having kids and bringing more people into their culture and having kids with them, et cetera, is huge. So we don't need everyone to have kids. We don't want everyone to have kids. We just need a few people to figure it out and to commit and to preserve their culture for this to work out. So there will be a big choke point. A lot of people aren't going to make it through. That's okay. The future is going to be bright. Our hope is that the future will be pluralistic. So that's our concern.
To be clear, it gets worse before it gets better.
Oh, I mean, yeah,
we are about to enter a world where you're going to have AIs that are dating people and are better than any human you could date, and that have deep fakes of the most attractive person in the world. Or I don't know if you guys have seen the new filter thing on TikTok that can make old people into young, TikTok prostitutes and stuff like that, right? Like, the idea is that we live in a world today where even just to find a partner, if you are at all motivated by hedonism, you are going to be hard selected out of the gene pool. Like right now, it's like soft. Well, it is pretty hard selection, but it's going to get so much harder. Anybody who is, I mean, you'll be able to simulate Andrew Tate's lifestyle in a VR environment. The average person can do this in 20 years or 30 years. Like that'll be something our kids will have to choose between and trying to live like an efficacious, meaningful life in the real world, right? And I think that a lot of cultures are just going to be deleted from the timeline because of that. And that makes us sad because that's a huge loss in cultural diversity. But what's cool is if you look at the wider economics of this, so we live in a world where the economy is decreasing on average, right? And most technophilic cultures have died out, right? Because most of the cultures that are resistant to this mess are highly antagonistic towards technology. That means the only place it really makes sense to invest are on these sort of like cultural clusters of these technophilic high birth rate cultures. And that's where things get really cool, because now all of a sudden something happens that hasn't been the case in most of human history, which is that the individual human life has value and is worth investing in at the corporate level. The individual culture has value. So if you have a cultural enclave, like some sort of haven technophilic high fertility city state, well, it makes a lot of money it makes a lot of sense to put money into that, which allows for that dynamism to spread. So in the long run, this could be really positive.
Alia asks a really good question, which is about the role that relationships play in this, how our approach to finding a partner and our experience as parents hinges on the dynamics of our relationship, which having—
Want to talk about marriage markets, London season, stuff like
that?
So,
we do think that to a great extent, broken relationship markets and partner finding markets are playing a huge role in the plummeting birth rates. Like it's really hard to find a partner right now, for many reasons that we could spend hours and hours talking about. One solution that we have posited in the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion is to basically bring back the London season, which was a cultural institution that saw its height around Regency era England, in which a cluster of families, in this case like wealthy landed gentry, would have a series of social gatherings during the parliamentary season, when everyone from a dispersed series of country houses would all converge onto London, and then their sons and daughters would meet at these balls and parties and social events and date, and then subsequently marry. And it was a very, very impactful tradition, because it was a way that people with aligned interests and cultural values and lifestyles would be able to meet intent-driven members of the opposite sex that were looking actively for marriage. So it was a great institution. We're thinking it would be really awesome to bring it back, but sort of to bring it back among aligned different cultural houses that are interested in building intergenerationally durable cultures and having their children find high quality partners. So we're actively working on launching the new London season, but whatever this new version of it is. We also think that the nature of relationships needs to be revisited to make parenting more sustainable. This is sort of a rabbit hole that we're going to, I think, try not to go down too far, because I know there's not a whole lot of time, but the nature of marriages now, and this concept of the nuclear family, we think is more an aberration, like a sort of an unsustainable blip, and not really a good reflection of what relationships are meant to be, that sort of emerged in the 1950s and has sort of been solidified in people's minds, because it was around that time that a lot of like TV programs and other things came out that kind of gave us the picture of like, this is what a family is. Whereas what we think the real family is more like, as some historians put it, the corporate family, which is a couple, their children, and extended family, sometimes employees, all kind of working together in a collective way, sharing childcare burdens, collaborating, and also being more oriented around a family vision, rather than treating children like human pets and treating partners like concubines. Like right now, people often think about a partner as like, who's this person who's going to keep me entertained and have fun with me? And they don't look at a partner and look at like, hey, who's someone who's value aligned, who I'd be willing to work with for the rest of my life, which is what it used to be. So we also think that, some reformation to the concept of relationships would be really beneficial in returning different cultures to high birth rate status. Malcolm, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to go answer the other question that came through while you were talking, which is Steelman the best alternate argument? So we go over, I think, what a lot of people, I think most of the antinatalist arguments are pretty like not smart. We go over them in the appendix of our book. But the one that really gets me is the one my mom always uses. So my mom is always telling us how stupid we are being in the public about this, and that birth rates just don't matter anymore. And she's like, look, it's all about AI. AI will simulate people. We don't really need a large population in the future. Now, let's be clear about what this perspective is actually arguing, because it's not arguing that like AI is going to give us UBI or anything like that. That is just farcical. Every time the elite have given power to the non-elite, it has been because they needed them. Like in ancient Athens, when you got the first democracy, it was because they needed to protect their shipping lanes, which they did with triremes that required a large number of low education individuals or low wealth individuals, when before that it was land battles that required armor, and therefore only aristocrats needed to vote. Now everyone needed to vote. If you look at the Magna Carta and stuff like that, that happened after the Black Plague, when all of a sudden, the serfs had power again. The AI is the thing that finally frees the bourgeoisie from the proletariat, from any care of them at all. And so I argue that my mom's perspective is probably just make sure you're on the right side of this divide when it comes, because there's going to be the people who own the AI and the people who don't own the AI, and human beings like kids don't really matter in that world. And I say that is probably the strongest, because I think it could kind of be true depending on how the AI thing plays out. I mean, in one scenario, AI kills us all, right? In one scenario, AI is basically a benevolent God that makes everything easier. In one scenario, like somehow humans are finally responsible with some technology and we do get like UBI and everyone gets a nice thing. But I think of the not killing us all scenarios, the most likely is that AI just dramatically consolidates power among the people who already have power. And in that world, do human lives matter? My counter argument to that would be, well, if those people who control the AI aren't having kids themselves, they're still going to need some sort of technophilic human chaff for something, hopefully, but maybe not.
I'll add to that. I mean, I think I'm more intuitively antinatalist than Malcolm is. If you really think suffering is bad and you don't think and that's sort of the top thing that matters to you, then humans shouldn't exist, because humans suffer. But Malcolm and I hold that, ultimately, suffering is a signal that humans evolved, because humans who suffer are also motivated to survive. And without suffering, you don't get organisms. Like, you could argue that AI can't exist without suffering, because it needs feedback to, sort of determine whether or not it is moving in the right direction. So basically, you can't have progress, you can't have any form of functionality without some form of suffering, which is to say negative feedback. And so, I think it's kind of a ridiculous, farcical argument. But if you are nihilistic and all you really care about is an immediate subjective experience, and you also think that negative subjective experiences wipe out the positives of positive subjective experiences, then sure, antinatalism for the win.
So if somebody is interested in, especially like a young woman is interested in what you're saying, what would you suggest for her in terms of actually building a dynasty?
So, I mean, we're working on this with a young woman who runs our foundation right now, which you guys should talk to at some point. She's a great person. But the reality is that if you're a young woman while you realize this, the most important thing to note is that society is lying to you about when you need to lock down a husband. Just both biologically and when your market value is disproportionately highest, much younger than society is telling you. You should be aiming to be married by 25. And it's going to get harder and harder for you pretty dramatically every year after that. And in the Pragmatist Guide to Relationships, we go over all the statistics on this. If it's a bit older woman, we'd say you're probably in a bad position, especially if you're successful. It's really hard for successful women at the age our society tells them to get married, which is around 30, to find partners these days. Just because there aren't a lot of successful guys on the market. And again, this is something why we're so interested in like trying to recreate dating markets and stuff like that. But the thing we keep noticing, as Simone says, is middle-aged guys right now are totally unrealistic.
Yeah, so if we were pitching or like trying to help a woman older than 30 years old, we would encourage her to not consider things like polyamory to be a deal breaker, and to also not maintain unrealistic standards, and to be willing to take very creative approaches to relationships and having kids. And also for younger women, I think younger women have very inflated understandings of their market value. Because it's very easy for men on dating platforms to signal, like to falsely signal. So like a woman will think that a guy who's sleeping with her is sleeping with her because he's interested in a long-term relationship, where it's just much easier for him to have sex, to have easy sex, to signal that to all the women that he's having sex with. And often it's easier for him to have sex with women who are sort of below his market value. So we call it the lazy 8 problem. And that leads a lot of women who are like, let's say like 5, 6, and 7s to think that they could nail down and marry an 8, 9, or 10, when really, yes, they are right now sleeping with 8s, 9s, and 10s, but only because they're lazy. And they would never actually seriously commit to them. So there's a lot of really bad false signaling that is creating unrealistic expectations and dating markets that we try to, when we're speaking with women who are on dating markets, sort of dispel from them, because otherwise they're going to be like, oh, I could do better. I'm going to wait. This guy isn't good enough for me. And then 10 years go by and suddenly they're in an even worse position.
And what about a man who is in the position to have a big family? What should he be looking for?
Definitely looking to marry young and as soon as possible. And I think men are very tempted to, one, because they're in a very bad negotiating position
when they're younger,
early on. They don't think that it's worth it to try to get married early because they will be in a better negotiating position later. I think the problem is that later, when they are in a strong negotiating position, we'll say like 35 and after, and they can basically look at women like 20 and above and like, all's fair game. The problem is that they can and will date younger women. And then when they actually think about marrying them, like these women are not really emotionally mature. They're not an intellectual equal. Like it's a lot harder to have a sustainable partnership where the woman is really bringing everything to the table she should be bringing.
Yeah.
But then they're not willing to date or marry older women because they're not as sexy. So like they also have this very bad false, because also there's so many options. They think that like, oh, well, I can combine youth and sexiness with intellectual caliber / career success and wealth, and they don't realize that you can't have it all. So a lot of it again comes down to being really practical about what you can get and nailing it down.
So immediate.
Yeah.
Just both ways, it's lock it down immediately and choose somebody who you can work with and who you have some level of value alignment with, and you're interested in that level of intellectual engagement. Generally, I'd say if you can't work with someone, you probably shouldn't marry them. And that's something that's a very spicy take. Because a lot of people are like, I could never work with my spouse. And it's like, you've chosen to live your life with. What do you mean you couldn't work with them? Anyway, so somebody was asking, I missed a point. Oh, what is it about diverse cultures which leads to higher fertility rates? We think there's two things going on here. One is cultures that are constantly sharpening themselves against other cultures through intercultural competition are just fitter, like they're just better cultures. Two is I think that it leads to some level of like cultural fear, like there's another group here, we have to outcompete them. Like both of those are the negative things. I think the positive thing is that it leads to the cultural group feeling more like a thing. When you're in Korea, being Korean doesn't necessarily feel like a thing because there is no other cultural group to compare yourself to. Whereas, if I'm regularly going to the supermarket and I'm seeing people who dress differently than me and who talk differently than me and who think different things about the world than me, then I know, oh, I'm an X and X's do Y. And I think what's really toxic is a lot of people's way that they respond to collapsing birth rates and stuff like that is to say, I'm an X, and then X is an ethnicity. right? And I think that's the wrong way to handle it, which is why we focus so much on the idea of sort of ideological tribes. I'm a, X cultural group, and then trying to move that forwards. But this idea of cultural groups and forming new cultural groups, I think, is something that, in cultural group alliances, is something that we just don't have a lot of experience with as a species, because for so long we were just dealing with sort of inherited cultural groups. Sorry, I missed stuff that was being asked or.
No, I think it's all good. Do you have any final statements as we wrap up the session here today?
Well, I mean, we've probably said a lot of offensive stuff. I apologize. I mean, I think that we are really moving towards a beautiful future in a way. And this can be seen in, what's going on in Russia right now, which is, we used to live in a world where if you wanted your cultural group to dominate another cultural group, you would kill these people and you would take their land and you take their resources. And today that just doesn't make sense. That's how you delete your own cultural group. When I'm in Korea, I'm constantly reminded of, this is land, now that it's depopulating, who's going to be there in 100 years to take it? The Japanese have been trying to take it throughout history. The Chinese have been trying to take it throughout history. And both of these other groups now, they're not going to have populations either. They're not moving in. And so you now win on the historical stage, not by going out and killing people, not even by converting people, but through loving people. And by that, what I mean is you can have a lot of sex and have a lot of kids, but if those kids don't grow up feeling like the culture they grew up in loved them and cared about them, and it's something they want to perpetuate, then they're going to breed like caged panda bears, just like everyone else. And so we actually live in a world today where you can conquer through love. Now, that is one strategy. Unfortunately, the other strategy that we've mentioned is you can also defeat other cultures by enforcing gender inequality, destroying your local economy, removing access to education. So I think that might be the future dichotomy that we'll see within our species, is cultural groups that are interested in this sort of pluralistic world that is perpetuated through creating kids who love their lives, and then other cultural groups that are just like far conservative, extremist, ISIS-y sort of groups that just want everyone to be like them. And I think
in the book, Malcolm says we're not heading to an idiocracy, we're heading to an ISISocracy. And we're not saying like Islam per se, we're just saying like
a bunch of ISISes from all sorts of different cultural traditions.
Yeah, technophobic, misogynistic cultures. Yeah. So buckle up, folks. And this is a long game, so play it with us, please. We'd love to.
Oh, and if you check out our latest book on religion, for whatever reason, Audible has been delaying the audiobook. If you get the Kindle or the book, there's a free link in it that you can email, and we'll send you the audiobook files because they're done. Just Kindle's being annoying.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for coming and for all the work that you're doing to promote the subject in the public sphere and help families create the future. That's really amazing. Thank you. Fantastic. And then I'm just going to plug an event that we have coming up here at the Stoa, Money Trauma, with Miho soon, March 9th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So with that, we'll close the space. Thank you all so much for coming today.